Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Maasros Perek Beis Halacha Gimel. We're learning today Daf Yud Zayin. We left off on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, 4 lines from the top of the Amud, and we are dedicating today's class Le'ilui Nishmas Rav Moshe Aaron ben Ezriel Halevi. That's Rav Shlomo's father, whose yahrzeit is today. May his neshama have an aliyah. Amen. So really, we left off 4 lines from the top of the Amud. After quoting the Machlokes Rab Meir and the Chachamim, we're going to quote now a third opinion. For the sake of coming back into the flow, it's worth it that in today's share we're going to go back to the top of the Amud, Mamash on the top, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. We're quoting a Braisa. Behemshach to what we learned in the previous share, we are learning about a product, either tamarim, dates, or groigeres, or dried figs, which could be perfectly marketable as they are. But the case here will be that the buyer plans to do another step for the buyer to come to his personal gemar malacha, whether it is by tamarim that he wants to press it into a cake, this is the buyer, whether it is he has the dried figs, but he wants to beat it into the barrel. And as we have been learning in our sugya, the question is whether a sale is going to be koiveya, even if there's no gemar malacha, very similar to the machlekes we have in the Mishnah between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, whether truma is going to be koiveya if the item is not yet gemar malachet. Rabbi Eliezer says yes, and the Chachamim, with the exception of the basket of figs, say no. They say that if there isn't gemar malacha, even though you separated truma, the item is still allowed to be eaten. So we're going to have a very interesting machlokes Rav Meir and the Chachamim. We're going to go over it when we learn it inside. But really, what we're starting today will be a chiddush that we're going to have a third opinion that appears to be a little bit of one, a little bit of the other. And b'chlal in life, when you pick a little bit like one and a little bit like the other, what you are really doing is that you're living out a contradiction. This third opinion is going to, at first glance, be very problematic. And then the Gemara is going to have a very innovative understanding of how are we to reconcile this third opinion. I'll leave it vague because I want to properly review our case, Dafka, when we learn it inside. But from there, the Gemara today will go on to the Shita of Rabbi Shimon that we had in the Mishnah, that Rabbi Shimon, the way we learned, the way we'll see in the Gemara, completely rejects one of the Shisha Devarim. Rabbi Shimon completely rejects Truma as being something or an event or an action that is going to bring the produce into its kavius. He rejects that. And that's true even if the produce attained gemar malacha, but there wasn't yet the iyas penei habayis. And the person separates truma. Rab Shimon rejects that truma does anything. The same permissibility to consume achilas aray from this item because there wasn't yet the iyas penei habayis will continue even though one separated truma. The Gemara is going to give us a rationale behind Rab Shimon. The Gemara is going to ask whether Rab Shimon, if you separated truma and then ma'aser rishon, maybe at this point Rab Shimon will be moida that these two events, these two actions express your being machshiv the produce as is. And maybe now you would be asur to eat it b'achilas aray. We're going to see the Gemara will come to a resolution to that question. And from there, we're going to move on to the final topic in the Mishnah, which is the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. That is speaking about already about a mekach, a sale, being an event. Again, it's one of the Shisha Devarim that will bring the produce into a kvius, which would mean that from that point onwards, one may not eat achilas aray. And we had the chiddush of Rabbi Yehuda, who agrees that mekach is koiveya, but he says if the seller is giving the item to the buyer, the item that the buyer bought, but he's only giving it to him one at a time. So the example in the Mishnah was he sold him figs, so he gives him a fig at a time. The buyer takes a fig and he eats it. He takes a fig and he eats it. Such a type of sale will not be koiveya. Only if there is tziruf, which the way we are learning means when the seller is combining at least 2 of the items bought. So the buyer is receiving 2. That is where mekach will be. Koiveya will speak out the logic behind it. And the chiddush that we'll learn today in the Gemara will be is that even Rabbi Meir agrees to Rabbi Yehuda, when the buyer is himself picking it off the tree, which is gavaldik. That means if the buyer goes, he gives money to the seller. Let's use our example of the fig tree. And he goes into the seller's field and he picks off the tree one at a time. He takes a fig and he eats it. He takes a fig and he eats it. Even the mayor is going to be moided to this concept that in this case, mekach will not be koiveya. Where do they argue? Where the seller is giving it to the buyer. Over there, Rabbi Meir does not differentiate one or more. No need for tziruf. And Rabbi Yehuda says the same will be there as well. Ultimately, we will focus on the proof that Rabbi Yehuda brings for his opinion from the fact, it's a known story, that the Ginas Viradin, as we said, based on the Gemara in Bava Kama, Bavli, Pei Beis, Amid Beis, that no one is allowed to have Ginois nor Pardesois in Yerushalmi. Eloma, they allowed, from the days of the earlier Nevi'im, there was one allowed rose garden because it was needed for one of the ingredients, the Kippas Hayardin in the Ketoides. Evidently, in the times of the Mishnah, in the times of Rabbi Yehuda, in addition to, or maybe only, we'll see in the Gemara today, to the roses, you had also figs grown there, and its fruits were very expensive. And Rabbi Yehuda just says a fact that when the seller would sell for a very high price figs to buyers, the seller would give it to them. He would only give it to them one at a time. That's just the way they did it. And no one ever separated Trumas Umaisres from those figs. Because when you get one fig at a time, eating a fig is called, by default, Achilas Aray. And like Shitas Rabbi Yehuda, that even though there is Mekach, one at a time is not Koiveya, and a lot more about that when we will conclude, God willing, today's daf by closing up this entire Halacha Gimel, leaving tomorrow for Halacha Dalet. So, Chevra, we're going to start on top of the Amid. And again, we're reviewing the Braisa that we concluded last class with. Says the Holy Braisa, Halikeach Tamarim. If someone buys, and another detail that becomes evident from a Am Haaretz, he buys Tamarim. Now, these dates really are great, but the buyer is still planning to be doiris them. He is planning to press them into a cake. So from the perspective of the buyer, this is an item that doesn't yet have Gemar Malacha. Now again, will Mekach affect Kvius if the item doesn't yet have Gemar Malacha? In our Mishnah, we did not see anything to that. We did see the Machlekes Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim regarding the same by Truma, whether separating Truma affect Kvius if the item doesn't yet have Gemar Malacha. That we have in the Mishnah. Mekach we didn't have, but as we will see, just to speak it out, that Rabbi Meir will hold like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Meir will hold that Mekach, Rabbi Eliezer is machmir by Truma, Mekach le Rabbi Meir will affect Kvius. So who also, or another example is you have a groigeres, you have, right, there's te'enim, which are plump figs, and the groigeres or the groigeres is the dried fig, which also could be eaten the way they are. But then sometimes people would take these dried figs and they would beat them into a barrel. And that's called ledushan. But the buyer who was it ledushan. So first of all, we say asur loichal mehem arai. Number one, that's the chumrah of Rav Meir, since he holds like Rabbi Eliezer. Doesn't matter that it was shaloi nigman malachton. The only thing that does matter is Mekach happened. Mekach happened, then it's koveya. That means you can't even have aray. And now Rav Meir says another chiddush, and this chiddush is going to be a kula. That on the other hand, so you can't eat aray, which means you have to separate the tithings. But you know what? You have to separate only the mai. Umisaknan the mai divrei Rav Meir. Now, why would you only have to separate the mai? So we read yesterday the Rashi, and that's predicated on the fact that even though it's moi nigman malachton from the perspective of the buyer, being that these items are edible as they are, we will say that the seller, who happens to be an Amaretz, but the seller viewed this product as davar shenigman malachton. On top of that, guys, don't forget, if the seller lechatchila planned to sell it, so where is there the gemar malacha? Not in the field. Then the seller separated trumas umaisves. Even if he planned to take it home, what we will say is that he took it home and then he changed his mind and he planned to sell it. either here or there, we are going with a presumption, Rabbi Meir, that the seller viewed these items as something that he, the seller, has to tithe, and he tithed it. Elama, since he's an Amaretz, you have another din, that you can't fully rely on him. That's without going into the details of a Nigmar Amalachta and of Kvios. Stamp, an Amaretz sells a product, the buyer has to be ma'aseret on the lenient level of the Mai, which is only Trumas Meiser from the Meiser Rishon. Then you keep the Meiser Rishon. The Meiser Sheni, you have to be redeemed. But the Meiser Ani, you don't have to give to the Ani, as we learned to all the Masechtas the Mai. So Masechtas, it's a leniency. Divrei Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim, they argue with Rav Meir on both points. First of all, they hold that since it's being bought before it's Gemar Melacha, and who determined that? The buyer determined that. The Chachamim here hold, like the Chachamim in the Mishnah by Truma, Mekach is koiveya, but only for a davar shenigmar malachta. Since these products, this tamar, that is still yet to be pressed into a cake, etc., since it's loy nigmar malachton, Mekach does not affect kivius. So therefore, you can have from it arai. But mitzat sheni, this leniency, b'derech mamela, brings a stringency. Why can he eat arai? Because there wasn't a gemar malacha. Well, if there wasn't a gemar malacha, why would Ama'aret separate anything? He doesn't have to separate anything. And we take say he didn't do anything. So now what must you do? Whenever you'll be misakin it, you have to be misakin it. This is where we left off yesterday. So atkan, it fits. Now here comes a huge chiddush, which appears, like a third opinion, half like Rav Meir, half like the Chachamim, but the higoyin of it will be difficult to chap at first glance. Now, this third opinion, just for the record, right, we are now 4 lines from the top of the Amid. Some don't even have the words divrei. But let's go with what we have. Divrei Rabbi Yossi here would mean, normally you quote a shita, divrei Rabbi Meir, right? We just had this in the Brais. Here, divrei Rabbi Yossi would mean that Rabbi Yossi said, Rabbi Yossi reported as was that both Rabbi Hila and Rabbi Lazar quoted either in the name of Chilfoi or Amar Rabbi Yoina, that Rabbi Hila and Rabbi Lazar said that we found it written in the notes of Chilfoi. So either they heard it verbally or they read it from his writings. That what? A third shita. Same case, right? Either the buyer bought tamarim that the buyer plans to make into a cake, or he bought dried figs, which the buyer plans to beat into a barrel. So, oichel mehem arai, this is aligning with the Chachamim. There's nothing wrong with Chilfoi siding with the Chachamim. Adarab. B'chal Rav Meir, even the Chavei Roi, generally, since we were not yoided l'soif daitoi, we don't paskin like him. Compounded with Yachid Verabim. The problem is that oichel mehem arai, but Umisaknon, let's get to the right girsa. Demai. This appears to be an inherent contradiction that doesn't work, right? When the Chachamim say oichel mehem arai, okay, the Chachamim hold that mekach is not koiveya. Very nice. Okay, so therefore the seller did nothing. So the seller did nothing. Then whenever you buyer decide you want to eat a proper meal from it, you want to take off the trumas or maasros, you have to take off everything. Why would you presume that the owner took off anything? But here we're not saying that. You can eat it arai, but you're masakin demai. So the Gemara says, "Vakasha." This third opinion doesn't work. Arai, then the din has to be misaknon vadai. Now let's go with the other hand. If Chalfoi felt that you're masaknon demai, right? That's like Rabbi Meir. So then he should have to say like Rabbi Meir. In other words, if the owner felt that you have to separate the trumas or maasros, it happens to be since he, the owner or the seller, is an Amaretz. You can't fully rely on him. But if he was already misakin it, let's say he took off Truma Gedoyla, then it should be usher even to eat arai. How do these two things go together? They don't. So says the Gemara, that Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Hila, no, it's the same one, quoted that oichel mehem arai. This third opinion holds that Keshitas not Rabbi Eliezer. They hold like the Chachamim by Truma. They say the same thing by Mekach, that since it's a davar shalei nigmar malachtoi, because since the buyer intends to process it one step more, we define this as a davar shalei nigmar malachtoi, and therefore Mekach will not be koiveya. So he de facto is allowed to eat aray. And now we're going to have a huge chiddush, which after you hear it, it's going to make a lot of sense regarding an am ha'aretz. So I know that last week when we learned about the am ha'aretz, we made our own comment amongst the chavra. This am ha'aretz is quite learned. Today we're going to learn that this am ha'aretz is not quite learned. This am ha'aretz, the seller, does not know. He doesn't know that mekach before nigmar malachton will not undergo a kvios. He doesn't know that. He's an am ha'aretz. He thinks mekach. I mean, he knows a lot. He just doesn't know everything. He knows some information. He knows that mekach is kaveya. So therefore, the seller, based on his erroneous understanding, he thinks the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer by Truma, or he thinks that the halacha is like Rabbi Meir by mekach, but he's wrong in that. But based on his wrong presumption, he feels that since I'm selling it and it's going to be kaveya, I, the seller, am chayiv to tithe it. It's amazing. Just like he knows that when you bring something into your house, which is correct, that bringing it into the house activates the tevel. He also thinks that he also thinks that he has to separate the trumas u'maisros over here because he knows that mekach is going to affect a kvius, and therefore he did take off. So on the other hand, if you took off trumas u'maisros, you shouldn't have to do anything. No, so that's the general halacha that when you buy produce from a am ha'aretz, you can't fully rely on him, and that's why this third opinion holds that u'masaknon demai, but you have the leniency, which is that you don't have to rush to do it. You are allowed to eat achilas aray. Beautiful. And now we are moving on to the next opinion in the Mishnah, which is Shitas Rabbi Shimon. Now, the example that Rabbi Shimon said that he completely rejects that truma is koiveya, even if there was gemar malacha. Rabbi Shimon holds truma is not koiveya, and the example the Mishnah gave was kalkolas te'enim. Now, what the Gemara wants to first establish is that even though the Mishnah just came off speaking about the kalkolas te'enim, right, the exception of the shita of the Chachamim against Rabbi Eliezer, which is probably why Rabbeinu HaKadosh put the example upon which Rab Shimon said his halacha, also regarding kalkolas te'enim, but you have to know that Rab Shimon's shita is regarding everything. In other words, no product will become tevel or will have its kivius established by giving off truma. That's the first thing we say. A basket of anything, don't limit Rab Shimon to te'enim. Now we have to understand why would he not hold that truma is going to be koiveya? Now, why should truma yet be koiveya? So there is from the many Rishonim that attempt to give one common logic behind all of the Shisha Devarim. And just for the record, really, in the Seder of the Rambam writes bias. Bias doesn't need a reason. Re'iyas penei ha-bias. That means if I am producing items and I'm bringing them home, even after the Gemar Malacha, prior to the Iyas penei ha-bias, I am not chayiv right now to separate the separations. I am allowed to eat achilas aray. The moment from when I brought it into my house, now it becomes fixed, it becomes established. That's a din Torah. The Chachamim added another 5 items. And by the way, we'll see soon that maybe the Chachamim added another 6 items, as we'll see soon in today's daf, whether the Iyas Penei Chatzer, which sounds similar to the Iyas Penei Habayis, is it a detail in the Iyas Penei Habayis? Will that be Koiveya Midoi Raisa? Even though we'll see in the next payday that the Chatzar has to be a protected Chatzar, or the Chatzar has to be, according to Rabbi Nechemya, a private Chatzar. We'll get into those details. But when the criteria of the Chatzar is met, either we can learn it's a detail in bias, or maybe the Iyas Penei Chatzar is another Derabanan event, whichever way. So we learned the Rambam. So you have Mekach, right, and you have Eish, and you have Melach, and you have Truma, etc. So Rab Shimon says, no, all of them share the common logic. The fact that the owner, I did something to my item, whether I salted it, whether I put it on fire, whether I sold it, whether I separated truma, I am expressing through that act, through that event, that I consider my produce in something significant. I'm putting it on fire. I'm already salting it. I'm already separating the truma gedola. My expression of importance, my projecting importance into that item now upgrades it to the point that it's koiveya it. That would be the logic. Okay, that logic should apply to truma as well. So here, Rab Shimon needs to have a svara why we would not apply it to truma, and the Gemara actually gives a gavaldik svara. Rab Shimon matem kal v'chaymer. What's this kal v'chaymer? Uma im b'shah sheyesh alel zika shloisha ma'asos. When you have tevel gomer complete, you didn't separate anything yet. Now, what needs to be separated? Truma gedola. That's number one. Then, even though, guys, and ma'aser rishon, even though ma'aser rishon itself may not be eaten by the Levi or to whoever the Levi will share it with until you take off truma gedola, but that's a detail. Until you take off Trumas Meiser, that's a prat that has to happen to the Meiser Rishon. But let's look at the remaining of the pile. The remaining of the pile needs to have three things prior for you to be able to eat it. Truma Gedola, Meiser Rishon, either Meiser Sheni or Meiser Ani. Those are the three. That's the Zika Shloisha Meisers. So Rab Shimon says beautiful, that even when the produce is so far away from it being completely misukin, there are three steps that still need to happen. Yet the halacha is that prior to it becoming kavua, prior to one being koiveya it, at omar mutar, you are allowed to eat from it aray. So it says Rab Shimon, when the owner took off truma, what did he do? When he took off truma, he brought it one step closer for it to be completely mesukin. Now you only have to separate two, ma'aser rishon and ma'aser sheni or ani. So it doesn't make sense that after separating truma, which diminishes its tithings, libations, it's becoming more mutter. What, now it's going to become usher to eat aray? The opposite. That's a svara for which Rab Shimon disagrees that truma b'chlal should affect the kvios. No, truma makes it more edible, not less edible. Now asks the Gemara, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis. We know from the Mishnah, whatever Rab Shimon's logic is, that truma itself is not kriveya, but maybe Rab Shimon will agree that if the owner separated both truma and ma'aser rishon, maybe now kriveya, maybe now it became established. Rishon ma'u sheyitboy l'sheni. In other words, do we say that since you took off both truma gedola and ma'aser rishon, now prior to you taking off ma'aser sheni, or in parentheses, in the third or sixth year, ma'aser ani, now maybe you can't even eat aray. That's the Gemara's question. There's a big problem with the Gemara's question. What's the big problem with the Gemara's question? We just learned on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph from the bottom, this svara of a kal v'chaymer. Well, that logic does not allow for us to even have such a havamina, because that logic will tell you that if a person took off truma and ma'aser rishon, so now there's even less tithing liability. Avada it's mutter. That's a problem on the Gemara's kasha, and that's going to be addressed in the top Rashirilio on the right column. Look down over here. In other words, first of all, the Rashirilio says that Aliba Rab Shimon Kuboy, that this is being asked. L'shitas Rab Shimon, mi amrinan kiven the beseder ma'aseres mafrish. So then now you took off truma and ma'aser rishon, v'atei kava or not? Asks the Rashirilio va'aflagav to Amar Rab Shimon, ein oleo zikas gimel ma'aseres. His logic of the kal v'chaymer should apply even more over here. So the Rashirilio says beautiful. He says that the people who ask this question, even though the answer will be this kal v'chaymer, but the people who asked this question did not know whether this is indeed the main reason for Rab Shimon. Dilma, hai la viker tamid Rab Shimon hu? Ella, because there was another way of understanding the shita of Rab Shimon, and if the other is correct, then there is place for this question. Now, what would be the other reason? Ella the truma likava, because the ein hagoyren nekar ella imkein tarmin oisai. It was a customary procedure that when people were going to be removing the grain from the threshing floor, they felt something they have to already give back to God. And that something was Truma Gedolah. Now, of course, Chavre, when people want to allow themselves to eat arai, we don't paskin like Rav Shimon. And these people go ahead, and if everyone would take off Truma, then they would not be allowed to eat arai. We know that. It was still customary for people to take off Truma Gedolah. It was like this ethic that you're removing your produce already from the threshing floor. It's like you're having a great season in business. Even before you make the real din v'cheshbon to see how much you're going to give Meiser, 10%, 20%, or whatever percent, Epis give right away. That was the way it worked. People would separate Truma right away. Now, that has a flip side effect, which is that if everyone has a minute, it became the norm that you separate Truma on the threshing floor or prior to removing it from the threshing floor. Don't tell me that the event of Truma means you're being machshiv the produce. No, you're not. Everyone is doing it. It's just the way it's done. This might have been the logic behind Rav Shimon. If indeed this would have been correct, there's a big place to ask the question. Truma was something that people separated on the threshing floor, right? People customarily felt it's not right to take it off the threshing floor, give 2%, or at least separate the 2%, not my sedishon. So if now the owner is separating my sedishon, he's demonstrating that the item is chashuv. Here, yesh makom loymar, that even let Rav Shimon, it is koiveya. And the Gemara answers, no. That the reason is not because it was a minig to remove trumas. That was not the reason. The reason was the Kal V'Chaimer. And we have the Kal V'Chaimer even more because instead of you having only 2 steps needed, now you only have 1 step needed. The Meiser Sheni or the Meiser Ani. Answers the Gemara, Ma im b'shoshi yesh olav zika shnei Meisers. Once we established, lit up Shimon, that even when you have the zika of 2 Meisers, because you already separated Truma Gedolah, but you still have Meiser Rishon and whichever one, Sheni or Ani. Rav Shimon holds mutter. So there is more steps that need to happen, still mutter. So if you take off Meiser Rishon, which means that you are 1 step closer to complete Mesukah, there's less tithing liability, then for sure it should be made mutter. In other words, the Kal V'Chaimer quoted in Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph is, let's say, the primary reasoning behind Rav Shimon, and that resolves this question. Let Rav Shimon, Truma Gedolah, Meiser Rishon, none of that will be kaveya. Okay, and now we are changing the topic. This new topic, which is the second case of the Mishnah, will go throughout the remaining of this chapter, and that is another one of the Shisha Devarim, which is Mekach. And again, we had Rav Meir and Rav Shimon. Let's begin just quoting the Gemara's quotation of the Mishnah. The Mishnah gave an example that if a buyer tells someone who owns a fig tree, Heilach Isar Zeh, I want to add the Chiddush, we'll see more tomorrow regarding what I'm saying right now. But here, what happened is that the buyer gave money to the seller even when the figs were still on the tree, which is very consequential. We'll leave that consequential for tomorrow. So, the buyer buys 5 figs. The seller, the case of the Mishnah is where the seller goes and he gives to the buyer those figs. Says Rabbi Meir, that's the case of Mekach, that what? That Mekach establishes Kavios, and the buyer, he only bought 5 figs, cannot even snack on them. He has to be Toirim U'Ma'aser. Comes Rabbi Huda and he says, wait, depends. If the seller gives at least 2 at a time to the buyer, so there is a tziruf, there is a gathering, there is a combination of. And let me just share right now, the logic behind the combination is because prior to going into the Echad Meshisha Devarim, prior to all that, let's go back to the rule that if someone is farming to market, to sell, the Gemar Melacha happens in the field. And what is the Gemar Melacha? I know we learned in the Mishnah, every item has another Gemar Melacha, but all of them have something in common. And that is that the farmer gathered his produce, and it is now in its final stage. But it's in its final stage as gathered. Like vegetables, when they're bundled, right? The figs, when they are in a basket, they're gathered. The grain, when they are in a pile, and smoothed. So there is a gathering step. Now, I know we're not speaking about merchandising, we're speaking about taking it home, and therefore, even though there's a Gemar Malacha, you can still have Achilas Aray. I got that. Midoiraisa Riyas Pnei Habayis. We're discussing Mekach. I get it. But Rabbi Yehuda wants from Mekach to be at least similar to the original Gemar Malacha. If the buyer is taking 2 figs, so there was a gathering over here. Oh, and Mekach, okay, Koiveya. If you don't have a gathering, even though there was a sale, so holds Rabbi Yehuda. Now, slowly. First of all, Rab Ze'eda b'shem Rabbi Yechanan and Rab Hila b'shem Rabbi Lazar. And they have a huge chiddush. Ma pligin, you know where they argue. Let's limit their argument. Only beloiked v'noisenly, only when the seller is the one giving the figs to the buyer. So here, Rabbi Yehuda holds, if he gives it to him one by one, no kavios, even though there was a sale. But if the buyer is the one himself picking the figs off the tree or any other item, even Abmeir, Kol Amel Moide, even Amel will be Moide, Shu Oichel Achas Achas Upater. That if he only picks one at a time, he won't have to be Koidem Umaaser. Nothing became established. Only the Imtseiraf you'll be Chayiv. Now, the emesis is that we'll see that clearly from the next Mishnah, but the Gemara doesn't even have to go there. Says the Gemara, Rab Hila b'shem Rab Lazar, right? The second Tamoida now says that Keshem shehein chalukin kan ka chalukin b'chatzar beishmiram, which is we're speaking here b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda. We're not going back to where Rabbi Meir agrees to Rabbi Yehuda. That this leniency of Rabbi Yehuda, that Mekach needs with it a tziruf, a gathering, for it to be somewhat similar to Gemar Malacha. Just like Rabbi Yehuda says it regarding a sale, Mekach, he'll say the same thing regarding the Iyas Pnei Chatzar. Now, I want to just add the words. The words are not Chatzar. It's Bachatzar Beis Shemira. We already quoted the Mishnah and Daf Chav Zayin in the beginning of the 3rd chapter, that the Iyas Pnei Chatzar, as we'll see in a moment, whether that's a Doiraisa like bias, whether it's like a new Derabanan, regardless, not every Chatzar will be able to be Koiveya. It has to be Dumya the bias. What does it mean? Similar to the house? Really, many Tanoim say different things, but the Gemara here is focusing on it being protected. That if it's a protected courtyard, then it will affect Kivius like the Iyas Pnei Habayis. That's just the meaning Chatzar Beis Shemira. But we are following the Shita that Iyas Pnei Chatzar is only a Derabanan, and since it's only Kriveya et Midrabanan, we have the right to say that the leniency of Rabbi Yehuda that he gives by Mekach will be the same thing by the Iyas Pnei Chatzar. Why the same? Because they're both only affecting a Kvius Midrabanan. Which means that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, if the owner takes home his figs only one at a time, it won't help that it's one at a time. Because the Iyas Pnei Bayis is Kaveya Midoiraisa. The reason why we are lenient by Mekach, let Rabbi Yehuda we're lenient is because it's only a Derabanan. Well, if the Iyas Pnei Chatzar is also a Derabanan, that's where we get to say that Kishem, just like Rabbi Yehuda says, Mekach, the same will say with Iyas Pnei Chatzar, and indeed the Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that Mekach, one of the 6, Chatzar, one of the 6, the Iyas Pnei Chatzar, Shabbos, another one of the 6. By the way, Chatzar can be one of the 7. If you count Chatzar separate than bias, then you have 7. So one of the 6, one of the 7. These 3 are Einam Torah. And like we just explained, so since they are only going to affect the Kvios Midrabanan, we have the right to amplify or to connect the Kula of Rabbi Yehuda, Mi Mekach, L'Iyas Pnei Chatzar. The Gemara points out, Rav'imi B'Shem Rav Shimon ben Lakish, I don't agree with that. You know why? Because I, Rash Lakish, hold that the Iyas Pnei Chatzar and the Iyas Pnei Bayis are the same. They are both Koiveya Midoiraisa. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda won't have the koyach to limit that kvius by saying, there was no tziruf. Even one by one, it will become kovua. The correct from all other options, zuchatzar beis shmira, which is like the Iyas Pnei Habayis, which is koiveya midoiraisa, and Rabbi Yehuda won't be able to have his leniency by the Iyas Pnei Chatzar. Now, just interestingly, the Mara folder brings down here 4 lines from the top that in the Bavli, And Asoichet Asapayalam Daf Peches, the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yechanan to be saying there what Rabbi Shlokish says over here. That Rabbi Yechanan in the Bavli is quoted that Re'iyas Pnei Chotzer is Koiveya Mide Oiraisa, which L'chora just means that Rabbi Yechanan held initially, as we have him recorded over here. At some point, Reish Lakish convinced him, or he convinced himself that Reish Lakish is right, and he changed his mind. And his shita, his original Mishnah to Shaina here, Mishnah Achrayna there, Lochayim. Okay. Now, Zakti Gemara, Chavrai b'shem Rabbi Yechanan, Kach Meishiv Rabbi Yehuda es Rav Meir, based on what we learned above, and as we will have a proof to in tomorrow's class, but based on what we learned above, that even Rav Meir is moida, that if the buyer is the one to pick the figs off the tree or any other item, then Rav Meir also holds that if he picks them only one at a time, Mekach will not be koiveh. Based on that premise, Rabbi Yehuda challenged Rabbi Meir by telling him, since you agree with me that Mekach inherently does not affect the kvius, because if a sale would inherently affect the kvius, what's the difference whether you are getting one at a time or two at a time? Makes no difference. Eloma, you're telling me that it has to be Mekach and the fact that the seller is giving. Oh, now that the seller is giving, Rameir holds even one. Why? Giving, by the way, we had not what we learned 2 weeks ago, what we learned last week, that matana einoi kemechel. When a person gives his fig to a son in the field, we don't say, oh, a change of ownership. Now the son cannot have ade. We don't say that. So giving in itself doesn't affect the kvius. You, Rab Meir, are agreeing that the buying inherently, if the buyer picks it, doesn't affect the kvius, if it's only one. So why is it that if he's giving it to him, even one will affect it? It doesn't make sense. Let's read it inside. Kach Meishiv Rab Yuda es Rab Meir ein at moideli. Don't you agree to me? Don't you agree with me that in the case where one is gifting a fig to a son, that the din is shu pater, we don't say that he's chayiv. No, gifting doesn't affect the kvius. And you yourself are agreeing that if the buyer picks it himself, one at a time, weiter no kvius. So why is it that if the seller gives it to him one at a time, why would that be a kvius? Mali haloikit v'noisen lebenoi, mali haloikit v'noisen le'achar, mamush gavaldik. Okay, now, Zakti Gemara, Rabbi Yuden boyi, my chomes meimer beloikit v'noisen loi. How do you know? How do you know that Rav Meir only argues in the case where the seller gave the fix to the buyer? Maybe Rav Meir even argues by picking. Maybe Rav Meir holds that even when the buyer picks one at a time, since he bought it, he is chayiv to be ma'aser. And by the way, if Rav Meir will hold that, then Chavrai b'shem Rabbi Yechanan won't have this gross tshuva that Rabbi Yehuda has to Rav Meir. Now, how do we know that? As I'll say in a moment, really, we'll see that also from the next Mishnah, but we don't even have to go to the Mishnah, to Halacha Daled. We can stick to Halacha Gimel. Because what did the Mishnah conclude by quoting Rabbi Yehuda, bringing a fact, a story, just to prove his opinion, that in Yerushalmi there was this one Ginas Viradim, that we know that were there since the times of the Nevi'im. And we also know that no one ever was Taidem Ma'asir. All of the buyers that paid a lot of money to have the figs, they were never Ma'asir. Now, let's read it inside. Our Mishnah is not talking about where the buyer takes it. Our Mishnah is only speaking about the scenario where the seller gives the item to the buyer, min hada, from the story that the Mishnah brings, that Rabbi Yehuda brings to prove his shita, that there was a Ginas Viradim, etc., etc. Now, says the Gemara, Islach Meimar, Ginas Viradim Beloiket V'Eichel. It goes without saying that in that Ginas Viradim in Yerushalayim, even though Viradim means rose, but the Mishnah is speaking about people that bought figs from that Gino, which means that at some point, even if it may have started out as a rose garden, it also turned into a shtickle orchard. People added fig trees. But there were also roses there. That's a presumption that we're going to challenge. But that there was roses there. And it goes without saying that when you have a pardes that has roses in it, the seller will never allow buyers to walk in there because roses can very easily get ruined. He will for sure be taking the figs out to give it to the buyer. Ginas v'ravin b'loikid v'oichel. Could it even be that in a rose garden a buyer is going to collect it himself? Of course not. Loi! Exclamation mark. B'loikid v'noisen loi. Like I just explained. So ufachi, just like the maisa that Rabbi Yehuda brings for sure, was when the seller gave it to the buyer. The machlekes is dafka only when the seller gives it to the buyer, like we said before. That if the buyer picks it himself, even Rabbi Meir will be moided to Rabbi Yehuda. Now, why is it a given? The Gemara just says that in a rose garden that has also fruits, in our cases, fig trees, that when the seller sells some of its figs, for sure the buyer will never enter the garden because the seller will tell the buyer, in at olol, if you're going to come in yourself, at makalpel vardaya, you're going to ruin my roses, please don't come in there. Okay, that's the end of that. Now, who says there were roses there? That will be the final statement the Gemara will have against Rav Mana. Now, it's called Ginas V'Radin. Doesn't matter. The Gemara is going to tell us, by quoting a Braisa, that if a location had in the past, like in our case, roses, there would be nothing wrong calling it a rose garden, even after there are no longer roses in it. And let's dive. What do you mean? Nothing wrong, nothing right. Let's read the Braisa. Masnisa pliga al havoya de Rav Mana. This entire premise, this entire havoya of Rav Mana, it clearly does not agree with the following Braisa. Guys, we're going to go Daf Yud Ches all the way to the Mishnah. What does the Braisa say? That when a seller has a parcel of land that's called a vineyard, we're speaking about a parcel of land that for sure used to be a vineyard, and the oilam, the people in this location, refer to it as the karma. Once a parcel of land has a name attached to it, even if when the seller sells it, there isn't a single vine, the buyer cannot say, mekachtos, you tricked me. It doesn't work that way. Karma ani moichalach, afal pi she'ein bo ikfanim, the seller stands. Why? Shalei machaloi ela shemai. Because it's accepted, l'shitas habraisa, that since people call it a vineyard, doesn't need to have vines in it. And the same thing, this is not unique to vines. If a seller tells a buyer, I'm selling you my orchard. And this parcel of land is called by the people that live there, the orchard. Why? Because it used to be an orchard. And the halacha is, afapi, that during the sale, there wasn't a single tree in it. Why? Now, if Rav Mana would have held that this Braisa is halachically authentic, then the fact that people call that garden Ginas V'Radin doesn't mean that there has to be roses in it. And his whole premise that he was bringing, even though he could have proved it, like we'll see in a moment, from Halacha Dalet, but his premise, from the Maisa of Rabbi Yehuda, you see, is only speaking about a scenario where the seller gives it to the buyer. How do you know? If there are roses there, he knows, because like we just said, a seller would not allow a buyer to walk into his rose field. Maybe there are no roses there, and it can still be called Ginas V'Radin. So the conclusion of this sugya is that Rav Mana obviously rejects the Braisa, and therefore l'shitas Rav Mana, right? If I'm selling to you a vineyard, it's not enough that people call it the vineyard. There actually has to be vines in it, and if not, the buyer can say mekachtos and get his money back. Chavra, God willing, to be continued.